June 25, 1876. The rolling hills of Montana echo with the thunder of hooves. Dust chokes the air, muskets crack, war cries pierce the wind, and one name, Custer, burns its way into American legend. But this isn't the story you think you know. This isn't about a brave general making a glorious last stand. This is about ambition, arrogance, betrayal, and blood. Welcome to Empire History Central, where we peel back the myths and show you the raw, unfiltered past. If you're hungry for the truth behind history's most dramatic moments, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Because today, we're diving deep into one of America's most infamous military disasters. George Armstrong Custer was born in 1839 in New Rumley, Ohio, a small dot on the map, but even then, he seemed destined to reach beyond it. Mischievous, fiercely competitive, and utterly unshakable in confidence, young Custer was a man out of step with rules, yet perfectly suited to war. He barely scraped into West Point and barely scraped out, graduating dead last in his class of 1861. Yet war has a strange way of finding use for the unconventional. When the Civil War erupted, Custer's brashness became an asset. At just 23, he was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers. He rode headlong into danger, saber raised, golden curls flowing behind him. Some called him reckless, others called him fearless. Newspapers dubbed him the Boy General. For Custer, the battlefield was a stage, and he was the star. He fought in battles from Gettysburg to Appomattox, and though many questioned his methods, few could deny his charisma or his results. But when the guns fell silent in 1865 and the Union was saved, Custer was no longer needed in glory. Peace, for a man like him, was the real enemy. The American frontier was no less bloody than Gettysburg. It was just less organized. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army turned westward, tasked with enforcing the government's expansionist vision and dealing with the indigenous nations that stood in its way. To many Americans, the West was a blank canvas. To the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others, it was home. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, treaties were signed and broken with grim regularity. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in 1868, was one of the most significant. It guaranteed the Lakota, the Black Hills of South Dakota, in perpetuity. The land was sacred, its caves, hills, and rivers woven into Lakota cosmology. But perpetuity lasted 6 years. In 1874, Custer was ordered to lead an expedition into the Black Hills under the pretext of building a fort. Instead, he found something far more powerful than gold. He found actual gold. When Custer returned east with tales of gold from the grassroots down, he ignited a stampede. Thousands of miners poured into the Black Hills, trampling treaties and indigenous rights underfoot. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration made a token effort to buy the land. When the Lakota refused to sell, Grant quietly decided on another strategy: war. The government labeled all non-reservation native bands as hostile and issued an ultimatum: return to the reservations by January 31, 1876, or face military action. It was a logistical impossibility. Many bands hadn't even heard of the deadline. Others refused it outright. Among them were Sitting Bull, the spiritual heart of the resistance, and Crazy Horse, a fierce and elusive tactician. Together, they gathered thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors along the Little Bighorn River. And so, war became inevitable. The U.S. Army devised a pincer strategy. 3 columns would converge on the native encampment from different directions. General Alfred Terry, with the 7th Cavalry under Custer, would move west from Dakota Territory. Colonel John Gibbon with troops from the west. General George Crook advancing from the south. But the terrain was brutal. Rivers swelled with spring melt. Roads were non-existent. And communication almost non-existent. In June 1876, Crook's column was ambushed at the Battle of the Rosebud. Though not a complete rout, Crook withdrew. leaving Custer unaware that the entire southern prong of the plan had collapsed. Meanwhile, Custer was moving fast, and alone. On June 22nd, Custer left the Yellowstone with 750 men and orders to find the native village and await reinforcements. But Custer had other plans. He believed speed was key, and glory was within reach. Fearing the native force would scatter if warned, he pushed his men hard. Scouts warned him the enemy was not a few scattered lodges, it was a vast and unified force. But Custer didn't listen. He split his regiment into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno took one wing, Captain Frederick Benteen another. Custer himself led the 3rd. It was a risky move, dividing an already small force in hostile territory. But Custer was confident, even jubilant. He believed he was about to win the fight that would secure his legacy. He was partly right. At dawn, Custer's scouts spotted the village nestled along the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of lodges stretched for miles. Still, Custer believed the element of surprise was his. At noon, he ordered Reno to attack from the south. Reno crossed the river and charged, but was met not with a scattering enemy, but a coordinated counterattack. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors poured from the village in waves. Reno panicked. He ordered a retreat into the timber. Then, fearing encirclement, he abandoned even that and fled uphill. Dozens of his men were killed as they scrambled back. Meanwhile, Custer, believing Reno was succeeding, pressed north to flank the village. Instead, he rode into the heart of the storm. We will never know exactly what happened in those final chaotic moments, but we do know the result. Survivors from the native side described a fierce and desperate fight. Custer's men were quickly overwhelmed, cut off, and outgunned. The 7th Cavalry was equipped with single-shot carbines, while many native warriors had repeating rifles taken from earlier battles or traded from white settlers. Custer's line collapsed. By the end, 210 soldiers lay dead, including Custer, his brothers Tom and Boston, his nephew Audie Reed, and much of his command. The battle had lasted less than 2 hours. There were no white survivors. When the bodies were found days later, they were stripped, mutilated, and left under the scorching sun. The army buried them hastily. Custer's corpse was reportedly untouched, save for bullet wounds to the chest and temple, though accounts vary. News of the disaster hit the East like a thunderclap. America, celebrating its centennial, was stunned. How could Custer, the Civil War hero, be dead, beaten by savages? Politicians demanded revenge. The army redoubled its efforts. Within a year, the Native alliance was shattered. The Lakota and Cheyenne were forced onto reservations. Crazy Horse was captured and killed. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, only to return years later and be murdered during an arrest. Victory at the Little Bighorn had changed nothing, except the mythology. Almost immediately, newspapers began crafting the legend of Custer's last stand. Illustrations showed him on a hilltop, saber raised, gallantly fighting to the end. Never mind that sabers hadn't been issued to the 7th Cavalry for years. Never mind that the hill he died on wasn't much of a hill. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story. Libby Custer, his widow, spent decades touring, writing, and speaking, defending her husband's legacy. He became a symbol of noble sacrifice, of American bravery, of manifest destiny. But was he a hero? Or a man who got hundreds killed chasing a legacy? For generations, Native voices were silenced in the telling of Little Bighorn. But slowly, their stories emerged. They tell of a man who underestimated them, of a people defending their homes and families, of warriors like Crazy Horse, Gall, and Two Moons, fighting not for conquest, but for survival. They spoke of courage, yes, but also of tragedy, for they knew what would come next. Victory was fleeting. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had won the battle, but they had already lost the war. Today, Little Bighorn is hallowed ground. The site contains memorials to both U.S. soldiers and native warriors. Headstones dot the rolling hills. A towering monument to the 7th Cavalry stands near a newer, more modest sculpture, honoring the native dead. The land remembers. And history whispers a warning. George Armstrong Custer remains one of the most polarizing figures in American history. To some, he's a tragic hero. To others, an arrogant fool. But one truth remains clear. At the Little Bighorn, myth met reality, and reality won. Empires rise, legends fall, and sometimes the truth is far more brutal than the story. If you found this deep dive into Custer's last stand revealing, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts. Was Custer a martyr or a madman? A hero or history's warning? Thanks for watching Empire History Central. Until next time, keep questioning the past to better understand the present.